Hi, and welcome back to our Apes Flipped Classroom, where we are continuing our conversation about water pollutants. So we'll begin with section 3 of Unit 8, which is endocrine disruptors and industrial water pollutants. So endocrine disruptors, we've touched on already, are any chemicals that interfere with the endocrine system of animals. And remember, the endocrine system is the hormone system or the hormonal system of the animals. Most endocrine disruptors work by binding to the cell receptors that are meant for hormones, which blocks the hormone from being received. Some also work in a way that they actually amplify the effects of the hormone. One of the most common sources of endocrine disruptors in our water systems is human medications that either pass through our urine and into sewage or occasionally are flushed down toilets. Because these are medications that frequently influence human hormones, they can also disrupt animal hormones. However, there's also a lot of other sources of endocrine disruptors. So as an example, the common herbicide atrazine binds to receptors of cells that should convert estrogen into testosterone in male frogs. When this happens, it leads to high estrogen in males, low sperm count, even intersex or feminization, which means that these frogs actually develop eggs in their testes, or they will even occasionally develop ovaries. So this has a huge impact on the ability of these frogs to reproduce. So atrazine, as I said, is one of the most common examples of an endocrine disruptor from agriculture. It's a broad spectrum herbicide that's used to control weeds. It prevents crop loss. It's applied to agricultural fields, and then it can run off into local surface water. It can be carried by the wind. And even if it doesn't run off, it can actually penetrate into the ground and into our aquifers and can contaminate human well water. Also, if we don't wash our produce well and there's atrazine on the surface of it, then it can enter the human body through unwashed produce. And of course, our animal friends that like to eat in our fields definitely don't wash their produce. Another example of an endocrine disruptor is DDT. This is another broad spectrum pesticide. This time it was an insecticide. It was phased out, but it has a very long half-life, so it does persist in the environment. When it was being used, it was applied to agricultural fields, and then from there it would run off into local surface water or groundwater or be carried by the wind, just as atrazine is. So DDT is one of the best known examples, and it actually caused issues with the formation of eggshells for a lot of birds of prey, not because they themselves ate the insecticide, but because they ate the animals that did eat the insecticide. And so they accumulated significant amounts of DDT in their bodies. So that's a great example, not only of an endocrine disruptor, but also of biomagnification and bioaccumulation, which we'll also touch on in this unit. And then another example of an endocrine disruptor is phthalates. So these are compounds that are commonly used in plastic and in cosmetics. A lot of the time you'll see on water bottles that it's BPA free, which is bisphenol phthalates free. And that's because they are known to be endocrine disruptors for humans as well as animals. There's some concerns about a link between BPA and other phthalates and breast cancer. Again, because these are compounds that are used in plastic and in cosmetics, these don't run off from fields, but they can enter our surface water, our groundwater through litter, whether that's intentional dumping or accidental dumping of trash. Also chemical waste from factories if they're not properly disposing of their waste, which is not a huge issue in the US because our regulations are so strict, but is a significant concern in a lot of developing countries. And then also from the leachate from landfill. So later on in this unit, we'll talk about landfills and how what can come out of them is contained. But if there's plastic in the landfill that contains phthalates and the water runs through there, that can actually wind up in our groundwater as well. They are also found in some cosmetics and in plastic food containers. It is becoming, because people are more aware of them, they're being used in fewer plastic food containers. Okay, and then our heavy metals, so lead, arsenic, mercury, cadmium, chromium. There are a lot of heavy metals out there, so we're going to focus on those individually, but many of the heavy metals are also endocrine disruptors. And then, of course, I touched on these already, human medications that enter sewage via human urine or flushed medicines. And this can be things like medication for birth control. It can be medication for menopause. It can be medication for a lot of different conditions as well. So a lot of human medications are endocrine disruptors. So talking about our heavy metals, we'll start with mercury. We talked about mercury when we talked about atmospheric pollution, because mercury is naturally occurring in coal and it's released by the combustion of coal or by the incineration of municipal trash, burning medical waste, heating limestone for cement. All of those are ways that mercury enters our atmosphere. It attaches to the particulate matter that's released in that burning process, and then it deposits in the soil or the water wherever that particulate matter settles. So once it settles, if it settles in water, then we can have mercury in the water. It can also be released if coal ash that's stored in ponds overflows and runs off. So mercury is an endocrine disruptor. It inhibits estrogen and insulin production, estrogen being one of the female hormones, insulin obviously being the hormone that helps us to process sugar. So significant issues here with mercury. Mercury is also known to be a teratogen, which means that it is harmful to developing fetuses. It can actually accumulate in the brain of a fetus, which is why pregnant women are usually advised to avoid eating large predatory fish, particularly, but seafood in general. Because mercury gets emitted into the atmosphere, gets deposited, it accumulates in lakes or reservoirs and streams, and it gets transported through the watersheds. And the bacteria in the water actually convert mercury, which is harmful but not as harmful, into methyl mercury. And methyl mercury bioaccumulates in the food webs, which means that there's more methyl mercury in the large predatory fish. And so when we eat large predatory fish, then we also consume methyl mercury. So that's the toxic form of mercury. And again, the higher up the food chain, the more of it there is. All right, two more heavy metals that you've heard of before. We touched briefly on arsenic when we talked about air pollution. We talked significantly about lead when we talked about air pollution. So we'll go back to that one as well. So arsenic is actually a naturally occurring element. It is also a poison, but it occurs in rocks. Those can dissolve into drinking water. Most drinking water in the American Midwest naturally has relatively high levels of arsenic. So people who have wells in the Midwest have to test their well water to make sure that it doesn't have dangerous levels of arsenic. That natural release into groundwater can be worsened by mining activities that allow more leaching of the arsenic into groundwater. Human sources, those anthropogenic sources, it used to be used in a lot of pesticides, a lot of rat poisons or other rodenticides contained arsenic. It used to be used in some pesticides that were applied to agricultural fields as well. It's no longer used there, but it can persist in the soil. Another big contributor to arsenic, and which was a significant contributor in our area, is wood treatment chemicals to prevent rot. And so most wood that was used in this area for building docks and piers used to be treated with arsenic to prevent rot. Unfortunately, that means that there's a lot of wood treated with arsenic that is in the bay and our rivers, and where that arsenic can actually leach into the water. There's also some of it naturally, sorry, not naturally, but there's some of it that is released in the combustion of coal or in coal ash. So arsenic is known to be a carcinogen, contributes to lung cancers, bladder cancers, kidney cancers specifically. It is also an endocrine disruptor, specifically our body's ability to process sugar. It can be removed with water filters. So even something as simple as an activated charcoal filter, or which is what we typically have as like Brita filters, or a reverse osmosis system will be able to remove arsenic from water. And then lead. So we talked about this when we talked about atmospheric pollution. Lead is found in old paint. It's also found in old water pipes, and it can also be found in soil that's contaminated by particulate matter from vehicle exhaust before lead was phased out of gas in 1976. It's also released in coal combustion, and lead is a neurotoxicant, which means it damages the central nervous system. It is particularly dangerous to children because their brains are still developing, and it has a more significant impact. It is also an endocrine disruptor and can also be removed with water filters. One of the ways that we can help prevent having lead contamination of our water is by replacing lead pipes with copper pipes, or by adding a sealant to existing lead pipes, but that does eventually wear away. And so a better and longer term solution is simply replacing lead pipe with either copper piping or with a plastic pipe. Okay, coal ash can be a huge source of mercury, lead, and arsenic. So coal ash can be emitted from the smokestack, particularly if you don't have good filtration systems that we talked about when we talked about atmospheric pollution, and it can be carried by the wind and gets deposited in ecosystems that are far, far away. If you have good filtration systems, those baghouse filters or dry scrubbers or electrostatic filters, whatever sort of filter we might have, that the coal ash is collected, it's often stored on site, and that's stored on site in ponds that get dug into the soil. Sometimes those get lined with plastic, but not always. So these ponds can leach water into the groundwater, which contaminates the groundwater with arsenic, lead, and mercury. The ponds can also, as we talked about with the manure ponds at CAFOs, can also overflow and run off into nearby surface waters and agricultural fields. So we can either leach into the groundwater or we can have runoff into surface waters. Okay, so your FRQ for this is to identify a toxic metal other than mercury that has a negative effect on human health and describe how it is introduced into the environment. So I know that's a lot of information. I hope it's helpful. I look forward to hearing your questions and seeing you in class.